When his wife of 50 years wandered off and disappeared into the forest, the search parties gave up after 3 days, but the old man refused to lose hope because he had one last idea that everyone said was foolish. He turned to his faithful old horse and whispered, "Find her." What that horse did next left the whole search party frozen in disbelief. Arthur Whitfield had spent 51 years waking up beside the same woman. When dementia came for Alina, it took her memories, then her bearings, and on a cold October morning, it took her into the woods. The official search spanned 60 square miles, deployed helicopters, and then ended. Only one soul still refused to abandon the hunt, a 14-year-old quarter horse named Jasper, who had never spent a single day apart from the woman who brushed him every sunset. What Arthur didn't know was that Jasper had been paying attention in ways no human ever could. For the past 3 years, ever since the diagnosis, Arthur had watched the woman he married slowly slip away like fog burning off a morning field. It began with small things: a misplaced coffee cup in the refrigerator, a forgotten grandchild's name. But by the spring of 2022, Alina no longer recognized the farmhouse where they had raised 4 children and buried a stillborn son. Arthur installed deadbolts high on the doors her muscle memory couldn't reach, but dementia is a patient thief, and it had already stolen the neural map that kept her tethered to home. The night before she vanished, Alina had woken at 3 in the morning, certain she needed to find her childhood pony in the pasture of a farm that had been sold 60 years ago. Arthur sat with her until dawn, stroking her papery hand, not correcting, just being present. That was the last time she looked at him with even a flicker of recognition. Jasper had been Alina's horse since the day he was foaled on their property. A stocky sorrel quarter horse with a white blaze shaped like a teardrop, he'd spent 14 years as her shadow. Every evening at sunset, Alina would brush his coat until it gleamed and whisper the small intimacies of her day into his twitching ears. When the dementia stole her words, the ritual continued in silence, just the steady scrape of bristles and the mare's deep, slow breathing. Arthur had noticed that Jasper would nicker softly whenever Alina approached, even from 100 yards away, even on days when she herself seemed lost inside the barn. The horse knew her in a way the doctors and medications never could. The morning of October 11th, Arthur was in the tool shed replacing a tractor belt when the silence fell. Alina had been sitting on the porch swing, a cup of cooling tea balanced on her knee. When he returned, the tea was spilled, the swing was empty, and the back gate, the one he'd forgotten to lock, swung wide open toward the national forest. By noon, Sheriff Collins had mobilized a full-grid search. Helicopters thumped overhead, tracking dogs strained at their leads, and volunteers fanned out through the black spruce stands, calling Alina's name until their voices went raw. 300 people covered 60 square miles of dense Vermont woodland over 72 hours. They found nothing, not a footprint, not a thread. On the afternoon of day 3, Sheriff Collins stood in Arthur's living room with his hat in his hands. The math was brutal, he explained. An 81-year-old woman, no medication, no food, nighttime temperatures dropping below 40 degrees. The statistical window for a live recovery had closed. The official search was suspended. Arthur nodded, said nothing, and walked out to the stable. Jasper was restless, shifting in his stall with an agitation Arthur had never seen. The horse's ears were pinned forward toward the forest, his nostrils flaring and contracting in a rapid rhythm that looked almost desperate. Arthur remembered then something he'd once read, that a horse's olfactory membrane holds over 300 million scent receptors, nearly 50 times what humans possess. He thought about the nightly brushing ritual, the way Alina's hands had carried the faint smell of lavender lotion, and the metallic tang of the arthritis cream she rubbed into her knuckles. Every sunset for 14 years, Elena had pressed that scent into Jasper's coat while she spoke her secrets. Arthur slid open the stall door. He didn't bother with a halter or lead rope. He leaned close to the horse's ear, his voice cracking with a desperation that had no room left for logic. "Find her, Jasper, find Elena." For a single heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the horse's whole body went still, the stillness of a predator locating prey, and he stepped out of the stable and into the yard where a dozen volunteers stood slumped in exhaustion, watching. Jasper walked past them without pause and stopped at the exact gatepost where Elena's hand had last rested. He lowered his nose to the wood, inhaled. Then, with a deliberate certainty that cut through every protocol and probability, he turned and began walking into the forest. The search party froze. No one spoke. The horse's gait was not wandering, it was a path, and Arthur, his heart slamming against his ribs, followed. The volunteers parted like water around a stone as Jasper strode past them, his ears pinned forward with an intensity that made their trained search dogs seem suddenly distracted. Sheriff Collins stepped forward, one hand raised in the universal gesture of a man about to issue an order he would later regret. "Arthur, we can't just let a horse lead a search. The area's been cleared. The dogs found nothing. We need to regroup and reassess." Arthur did not break stride. He did not look back. The words that left his mouth were spoken to the horse, not the sheriff. "Don't you listen to him, Jasper. You know the way." What Collins didn't understand was that Jasper was not a horse being led. He was a horse leading, and the certainty in his gait told any experienced horseman that this animal was not wandering. He was tracking. Deputy Marlene Sosa was the first to break protocol. She had grown up on a cattle ranch in Texas and had seen cutting horses read a cow's intent before the cow itself seemed to know it. She slung her radio over her shoulder and fell into step behind Arthur, her eyes fixed on Jasper's ears, which rotated like radar dishes, scanning, locating. 3 other volunteers followed, then 2 more. The sound of a dozen boots crunching through fallen leaves created a strange percussion that seemed to pulse in time with the horse's steady rhythm. Within the first 20 minutes, they entered terrain the grid search had not covered. This made no sense on paper. The Incident Command Center had mapped Elena's probable path using dementia-wandering data, which showed that disoriented elderly subjects almost invariably move downhill, follow the path of least resistance, and stop within half a mile of the point last seen. The teams had saturated those areas. They had nothing. Jasper took them uphill. The horse navigated a steep game trail that switchbacked through a dense stand of hemlock, his massive shoulders pushing through branches that slapped back at the humans following him. Arthur's lungs burned. His legs, at 79, were not what they had been, but he refused to slow down. He kept his eyes on the white teardrop blaze on Jasper's forehead, a beacon in the dim forest light. Half a mile in, Jasper stopped at a fork in the trail. The main path continued upward. A fainter secondary track veered left into a ravine choked with deadfall. The dogs had been run through here on day 1 and had shown no interest. Jasper lowered his nose to the earth, inhaling with deep, dragging breaths that made his nostrils flutter. Then, without hesitation, he turned left. Deputy Sosa glanced at the sheriff. Collins was panting, his face flushed with exertion and something else, the creeping suspicion that he had made a catastrophic mistake. The ravine was the one quadrant he had deprioritized after the canine team gave it a cold sweep. It was rocky, treacherous, and fit none of the behavioral profiles for a dementia patient on foot. "Jasper," Arthur whispered, "are you sure, boy?" The horse did not respond in any way a human could measure, but he moved forward, each hoof step deliberate, as if he were reading a map that only he could see. It was then that Arthur looked up at the canopy line and felt the hair on his arms stand up. He knew this place, not from search grids or topographical maps. He knew it from 40 years ago, from a time before the forest had grown this thick, when he and Alina had been young and the world had not yet asked so much of them. The Griswold cabin. It was a hunter's shack, built by Alina's father in 1962, half a mile ahead through the worst of the deadfall. She had spent childhood weekends there, learning to track deer and identify birdsong. And later, after they married, she had brought Arthur to this place every autumn. They would ride up together on a pair of quarter horses, Jasper's great-grandmother among them, and sit on the collapsing porch, watching the valley turn gold. Arthur had watched Alina's mind erode in 1,000 small agonies. He had accepted that she no longer remembered his name, their children's faces, the home they had built. But here was the truth that stopped his breath. Somewhere in the tangled neurons of her dying brain, a childhood trail had survived the wreckage, and she had been walking it for 3 days. This was not a search for a lost woman anymore. This was a pursuit of a ghost who had known exactly where she was going. Deputy Sosa was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. She's been heading for that cabin. She knew it was here. Sheriff Collins closed his eyes. The implication was a hammer. His entire operation had been calibrated to find a woman who was lost. But Alina Whitfield had never been lost. She had been going home. And home, for the fractured architecture of her memory, was not the farmhouse with Arthur and the porch swing. It was the place her father had first taught her she was safe. Jasper knew that, because for 14 years, Alina had brought him into these woods every autumn. Even after the dementia took her speech, she had still walked this horse along the fence line and stared up at this mountain. She had pointed her trembling hand toward the tree line and smiled, and Jasper had watched her do it. The search party pushed through the deadfall. The air grew colder as the ravine deepened, and the light filtering through the canopy turned gray and thin. Arthur kept his hand on Jasper's flank, feeling the heat of the animal's body, the steady pump of his heart, and he prayed for the first time in 3 days. A quarter mile from the cabin, they found the first physical evidence. A strip of pale blue fabric caught on a thorn bush. Arthur recognized it instantly. It was the edge of Alina's favorite shawl, the one she had been wearing on the porch swing, the one she had crocheted during the long winter after their son was stillborn. Pressed the wool to his face and inhaled. Lavender and arthritis cream. Jasper nickered softly, and then he stopped. The horse's entire body went rigid, his neck arched, his ears swiveling forward towards something the humans could not yet see. Arthur followed his gaze through the trees. The cabin was visible now, a hulking silhouette of rotting timber and collapsed shingles barely standing. The door was ajar, and then, from inside that dark rectangle of shadow, came a sound that stopped Arthur's heart cold. It was not a cry, it was not the silence of death. It was a horse, whinnying back. Arthur's legs buckled. The whinny that answered Jasper was thin and frantic, a cry of distress that no one expected to hear 4 miles deep in a forest that had been declared cold. Deputy Sosa reached for Arthur's arm, steadying him, while Sheriff Collins stood paralyzed, the weight of a suspended search crashing down around him. He had called it. He had stood in the living room and said the window was closed. Jasper surged forward, and the humans stumbled after him, tearing through the last screen of brush like they were clawing their way out of a grave. And then they saw her. Alina Whitfield was curled on the floor of the collapsing cabin, her body wrapped in the blue shawl that was now torn and blackened with mud. Her eyes were closed, her lips were cracked, but her chest was rising and falling, slow and shallow, a metronome of survival. And pressed against her side, its head resting across her frail body like a guardian, was a horse. Not Jasper, not any horse anyone recognized. It was a foal, a bay filly no more than 6 months old, emaciated and trembling. One of her hind legs was pinned beneath a fallen roof beam, the timber having crushed through the rotted floorboards, trapping her in a twisted prison of old wood and rusted nails. The filly had somehow survived the same 3 days that had nearly killed Alina, and in that impossible triangle of suffering, the two of them had kept each other alive. Arthur rushed to Alina, dropping to his knees, pressing his ear to her chest to confirm the heartbeat that his own terror refused to trust. "Alina, Alina, it's me, it's Arthur, I'm here." Her eyes flickered but did not open. A whisper escaped her lips, so faint it was barely a breath. "Daddy." She was not speaking to Arthur. She was 6 years old again, sheltered in her father's cabin, waiting for rescue she could not name. But it was the filly that told the deeper story. Alina's hands, even in her diminished state, were wrapped around a strip of her shawl that she had torn off and soaked in a trickle of rainwater seeping through the cracked ceiling. She had been pressing it to the filly's mouth, offering moisture, nursing a horse she had no business saving. The filly's eyes, wide with terror and exhaustion, tracked Jasper as he approached, and a low nicker rumbled in the foal's throat. Jasper answered, touching his nose to the filly's forehead with a gentleness that brought Deputy Sosa to tears. But here is what stopped the entire rescue party cold. There was no record of a missing foal in this county, no report of a lost horse, no tracks leading in from the forest. The filly had been inside that cabin for days, long enough that the floor beneath her was stained with waste, and the beam had begun to press deeper into her hindquarter each passing hour, and the only possible conclusion was one that should have been impossible. Alina had not found that filly. The filly had found Alina. The search party had assumed they were tracking a wandering dementia patient. They had never considered that she might have been following something. That in her fragmented mind, Alina had seen a young horse in distress, and that ancient maternal instinct, the same one that had raised 4 children and gentled a dozen foals over 50 years, had overridden every cognitive failure and propelled her into the woods behind a creature that needed her. Sheriff Collins finally found his voice. "We need extraction, we need a vet, we need a trauma team, now." But his radio crackled with nothing. The ravine walls blocked the signal, and they were 4 miles from the nearest road, with 2 lives hanging by threads and one of them pinned under half a ton of collapsed timber. And then Jasper did something that no one could explain. The old quarter horse backed away from the filly, lowered his head, and began pawing at the earth near the beam with a rhythmic, deliberate strike. Not a nervous tick, not a random behavior. He was showing them where to dig. He had located the weak point in the debris, the exact angle where leverage could be applied to lift the beam without crushing the filly's trapped leg. In 14 years, no one had trained Jasper for this. No one had taught him structural physics. But he had spent a lifetime watching Alina's hands solve problems around the farm, broken gates, stuck trailers, twisted halters, and somewhere in the deep, mysterious architecture of the equine brain, he had learned that if something was stuck, you worked from the base. The volunteers stared at the horse, then at the beam, then at each other. Deputy Sosa, the rancher's daughter, understood first. She grabbed a fallen branch, thick as a fence post, and wedged it under the timber at the exact spot Jasper had marked. 3 volunteers found handholds. Arthur refused to leave Alina's side, but he locked eyes with his horse, and in that moment there was no doubt about what needed to happen. On the count of 3, every human heaved against the makeshift lever. The beam groaned, shifted an inch, then 2. The filly screamed, a sound that tore through the silent forest and echoed off the valley walls, but her leg was free. She scrambled upward on 3 legs, her fourth dragging useless, and collapsed against Jasper's shoulder with a shudder that racked her entire body. Elena's eyes opened. She did not recognize Arthur. She did not recognize the cabin, but she saw the filly, alive and standing on trembling legs beside the horse she had brushed every sunset for 14 years, and she smiled. A tear tracked through the dirt on her cheek, and she spoke, clear as a bell, the first complete sentence she had formed in 6 months. "I told you he would find us." The pronoun hung in the air. He, not they, not the search party, the horse. She had known. Even in the broken cathedral of her mind, she had known that Jasper would come, that the bond she had woven into his coat every evening with a brush and a whisper was stronger than the disease that had stolen everything else. But the clock was now ticking in 2 directions at once. Elena was dehydrated and hypothermic, her body temperature dropping into a danger zone that would soon become irreversible. And the filly, freed from the beam, was revealing the full extent of her injuries, a deep laceration across her hock, the bone possibly fractured, infections setting in from 3 days of exposure. Getting either of them out of the ravine before dark would require a miracle. Getting both out alive would require something more. And then, through the crackle of Sheriff Collins's radio, a voice cut through. "Command to Collins, we have a civilian horse trailer at the trailhead. The owner says it belonged to the missing woman's husband. It's hitched and ready." Of all the details that no one had tracked, this was the one that now mattered most. Arthur had driven his truck and trailer to the trailhead 3 days ago on the first morning of the search, and he had never gone back for it. It had sat there, unnoticed, with 2 compartments and fresh hay, waiting for a purpose that the universe had now delivered. Jasper raised his head and whinnied into the deepening twilight. The filly answered, and Elena, held in Arthur's arms, whispered one more word that was not for the man who loved her, but for the horse who had never forgotten. Home. Getting 2 fragile bodies out of a ravine with no road access required a kind of logistical sorcery that search and rescue teams rarely practice. Sheriff Collins radioed for a medical helicopter, but the canopy was too thick, and the nearest clearing was over a mile to the east. The only extraction route was the same game trail Jasper had chosen, and it would take hours of careful movement. Deputy Sosa took charge of the filly. She splinted the injured leg with branches and strips torn from her own uniform shirt, working with the same hands that had saved dozens of calves and colts on her family's ranch. The filly fought at first, then seemed to understand that the hands were not there to hurt. She leaned into Jasper's massive body, letting the old horse's warmth steady her own trembling frame. For Elena, they had no stretcher. Arthur simply lifted her, all 94 pounds of her, and cradled her against his chest. She was lighter than the hay bales he still threw at 79, and that realization broke something inside him that he would not allow himself to feel until later. Right now he had to walk 4 miles, uphill in stretches, through deadfall and rock and the fading light of a Vermont afternoon that was bleeding toward darkness faster than anyone wanted to admit. Jasper led the way back, not following a scent this time, just walking steady and sure, like he understood that his job was not to find any more, but to bring everyone home. The volunteers flanked the procession, cutting branches, calling out obstacles, passing water bottles forward. Nobody spoke of the obvious, that Elena's pulse was threading, that the filly was beginning to limp more heavily, that the temperature was dropping again. But here is what held them all together. Every few hundred yards, Elena would murmur something into Arthur's shoulder, and every time it was the same word, Daddy. She was not calling for the man carrying her. She was calling for the man who had built the cabin, who had taught her to ride, who had died 30 years before she ever got lost in these woods. And yet Arthur answered her every time. "I'm here, sweetheart, I'm here," because that was the only lie that mattered. At the trailhead, the trailer was still hitched, just as the radio had promised. A veterinary team had arrived, summoned by the strange story spreading through the county on crackling scanner frequencies. A horse and a missing woman and a foal no one could identify. Dr. Patricia Harmon took one look at the filly and knew the leg could be saved, but she would need surgery, and soon. A second ambulance waited for Alina, its paramedics already running toward Arthur with a stretcher and blankets, and the kind of focused urgency that told him they knew how close the line had been. Arthur refused to let Alina go until they reached the ambulance doors. He laid her on the stretcher, kissed her forehead, and whispered something no one else heard. "Your father would be proud of you." For the first time all day, Alina's hand tightened around his, not the grip of a woman lost in the past. A squeeze, deliberate, present. They loaded the filly into the trailer beside Jasper, who immediately positioned himself so the young horse could lean against his flank for the ride. The old quarter horse had never sired a foal of his own, but in that small metal box bouncing down a dark highway, he stood with the patience of a father, letting the filly nuzzle into his mane as the miles passed. At the veterinary hospital, Dr. Harmon's team worked through the night. The laceration was deep, and the hock had a hairline fracture, but none of it was beyond repair. The filly was underweight and dehydrated, but her heart was strong, her lungs clear. The surgeon who pinned the bone later told Arthur that another 6 hours under that beam and the leg would have been lost. He did not say the word miracle. He did not have to. Alina was admitted to the county hospital with severe hypothermia and acute kidney stress from dehydration. For 2 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness, speaking in fragments of a childhood that had been over for 7 decades. The doctors warned Arthur that the physiological stress might accelerate the dementia, that she might emerge from this with even less of herself than she had taken into the woods. Arthur nodded, and he did not leave her bedside. On the 3rd morning, Alina opened her eyes. The room was quiet, machines beeping softly, morning light falling across the blanket in pale rectangles. She turned her head and looked at Arthur. And instead of the blankness he had braced for, he saw something he had not seen in months. "Arthur," she said. "Jasper, is he all right?" She knew his name. She knew the horse's name. She was in the present tense. The nurses would later call it a lucid window, a rare and unpredictable clearing in the storm of dementia that occasionally appears after severe stress. But Arthur did not care about clinical explanations. He held her hand and told her that Jasper was fine, that he had been the hero, that he had found her. And Alina smiled and said, "I know, I told him he would." The news of the rescue went national within 24 hours. Headlines called it "the horse who defied the search," and reporters descended on the small Vermont town with cameras and questions. Sheriff Collins gave a press conference in which he did something that law enforcement officers rarely do. He admitted he had been wrong. "I called the search based on data and probability," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "That horse operated on something I don't have a protocol for, and I'm grateful." But the story was not yet complete. There was still the question that had been burning since the moment Arthur first saw the filly in that ruined cabin. Where had she come from? The answer arrived 2 weeks later, and it was stranger than anyone could have imagined. A man named Howard Lassiter drove up to Arthur's farm in a rusted pickup truck, hat in hand, face etched with the kind of shame that had been compounding for months. He owned a small breeding operation 15 miles away. In the spring, one of his mares had delivered a bay filly with a white sock. She was a healthy foal, but Lassiter was drowning in debt, and the horse market had collapsed. He could not afford to feed her. He could not afford to keep her. And so one night in August, He had done the thing he would never forgive himself for. He had driven the filly out to the edge of the national forest and abandoned her. He had assumed she would wander out to a road, be found by someone, get a second chance. Instead, she had wandered deeper in, surviving on stream water and thin grasses until she stumbled into the collapsed cabin for shelter. And there, lost and starving, she had waited to die, until Alina found her. Lassiter offered to take the filly back. Arthur looked at the man, saw the lines of guilt carved around his mouth, and responded with words that were quiet but absolute. "No, she stays here." That was how the filly came to be named Ember, because she had been a spark left in the cold that should have gone out, and instead, she had kindled something that saved 2 lives. Ember recovered fully. The fracture healed without a limp, and within 3 months, she was galloping across Arthur's pastures with a joy that seemed to have no memory of the beam or the darkness or the days she spent nursing from a woman's soaked shawl. And then there was the final detail, the one that still makes Arthur pause when he tells this story. 3 weeks after the rescue, Arthur walked out to the barn at sunset and found Alina there. She was standing beside Jasper, a brush in her hand, stroking his coat in the slow, rhythmic pattern she had performed 14,000 times before. The dementia had not magically vanished. She still had days when she could not find the bathroom, days when she called Arthur by her father's name. But when she was with Jasper, some deep channel opened. She became Alina again. Not the woman the disease was stealing, but the woman who had gentled a scared filly in a broken cabin, who had followed a horse into the woods because her heart still knew what her mind had lost. And standing beside her that evening, watching Jasper close his eyes in contentment, Arthur understood something he would later try to explain to anyone who would listen. Jasper had not found Alina by scent alone. He had found her by following the thread of 14 years of love that she had woven into his skin at exactly this hour, in exactly this light. That thread had been stronger than the dementia, stronger than 60 square miles of forest, stronger than every protocol and probability that said an old woman lost in the cold should not come home. She came home because a horse refused to let her go, and because somewhere in the ruins of her memory, she had known he would. There are things we are taught to trust: data, protocols, expert opinion. And when a sheriff stands in your living room and tells you the search is over, every rational system in your brain compels you to accept that the person you love is gone. But rationality has a blind spot. It cannot measure the weight of a bond that has been forged over 14 years of sunsets. It cannot calculate the olfactory architecture of a horse who has memorized the precise scent of the hands that brushed him. And it cannot account for the stubborn human heart that refuses to stop beating for someone who still needs it. Arthur Whitfield spent $40 on a dying pregnant mare at an auction once, and that story ended with tears and miracles and a lesson about value that he has never stopped repeating. The Jasper story is the same truth, wearing a different coat. That the creatures we are told are just animals are often the ones paying the closest attention. That love etches itself into places science cannot yet map, and that some maps are drawn in scent and memory, and the muscle memory of a horse who never once doubted the destination. Alina still forgets things, most things on most days, but every evening at sunset, she walks to the barn with a brush in her hand, and she remembers exactly what matters. If this story reached you, if you've ever been found by someone who refused to give up on you, then you're in the right place. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that hope is not foolish. It's the only thing that has ever truly saved anyone.